Derek, what are we talking about today?
Well, we are talking about the manosphere, Mariko, and more specifically the manosphere in China.
And what's interesting is this idea of manosphere, it's usually seen to include online misogyny, especially on social media, but China kind of has its own manosphere, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me is that in the course of my research, I found that while the voices of the men in the manosphere in China sort of echoes the same narrative and rhetoric of the manosphere elsewhere, I think a lot of the root of the unhappiness of the men in China, well, part of the manosphere at least, they are driven more by economic forces than it is ideological differences, and that's what I found most interesting.
So there's a lot to discuss. So let's unpack that, shall we? As always, I'm Mariko in Singapore, and this is Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service. Twice a week, we bring you Asia Pacific stories, unpacked by those who know them best. Well, Derek Tai, of course, is from our podcast team. Welcome back.
Thank you, thank you.
And we're joined by two experts today, aren't we? Ling Tang is from the University of Melbourne. Welcome to Asia Pacific.
Thanks for inviting me. Hello, all.
We also have Yi Huan Zhang, who's a graduate researcher from the University of Macau. Thank you so much for coming on the pod.
Thanks for having me.
Shall we just start, Derek, by defining what manosphere is? Because, I think of, especially in the West, Andrew Tate, anti-feminism movement and so on, but there's kind of more official definition of the term, isn't there?
Yeah, it's hard. It's difficult to not talk about feminism if you want to talk about the manosphere, I think. Because the term manosphere is so broad, right? Like you said, I mean, even amongst our people on our own team, we couldn't nail down a proper definition of manosphere. It's a huge spectrum from all the way to the left, I guess, left in a sense of the spectrum. You have fitness influencers teaching men how to get fit, be healthy. And then on the extreme right, which is what we're talking about today, the extreme form of manosphere, it's characterized by, I think, and very intense vitriol against women, very anti-feminist. And what I find most interesting, I think what we talked about, right? What I find most interesting about this topic is that in, like you said, Andrew Tate in the US, they're sort of it overlaps with the alt-right or the extreme right, people on the right, politically speaking. In China, you don't have, there's no like left or right. So I don't know how the manosphere manifests itself in China, and also in the US, or rather in the West, you have big figures like Andrew Tate. You've got like, Andrew Tate like figures, his brother as well, that people sort of coalesce around on social media, and then they, buy into the ideology, the narratives. But in China, from my research, it seems like there isn't sort of like one or few big popular figures that people can gather around. It's just more like satellite influences. Wanted to get their take on it, because I think Yihuan, your research was centered on the manosphere in China, right?
Yes, you're right, Derek. Your observation and it aligned with my observation and my research. In China, looks like a very decentralized. And you can see that even the many men identify themselves as ordinary men, not the manosphere men. But they expressed ideas, looks like the manosphere ideas, like the women and feminism, who are, the the people to be blamed for their victimization situation, and the male suffering is caused by the popular feminism, and men in China are living very hard now at the time, things like that. Another condition that in China, we do not have the two-party political culture, or more party political culture. It's just ruled by the CCP. So, and also for CCP, the social stability is the most important thing. So, and the movement of Chinese manosphere is also depoliticized, because they cannot express the attacks on the state, or they cannot express the attacks on the system. But the most visible discourse of Chinese manosphere is they blaming the women blaming the popular feminism and things like that.
So the
Yeah.
CCP being the Chinese Communist Party. But I was actually wondering whether it's because of the internet being tightly controlled, often censored, that China doesn't have those, Andrew Tate-like figures. Are they kind of quashed because of the censorship or
Well,
not?
you just said that there are like figures online that are not, maybe not to the extent of Andrew Tate, but there are sort of anti-feminism narratives on social media like Weibo and Xiaohongshu. Am I correct?
Right. I just wish to jump in and say that just the ecology of the platforms in China are highly gendered too. For instance, the two platforms that you mentioned, Weibo and Xiaohongshu, maybe especially at the beginning because of the nature. For instance, Xiaohongshu started as a platform that's mainly for like women customers to share like cosmetics, review, and etc. So it really has like a rather, let's say, feminized sort of fan base or user base at the beginning.
I guess the big difference about China is because of its one child policy, which was in place for what, 35 years or so, that when parents chose to have boys instead of girls, and now you have way more men in their marriage age. I think I was reading like 22.5 million more men than women of marriage age group by 2027, and how those men being frustrated by not being able to find a partner. I mean, is that one of the reasons that they start to believe in those kind of anti-feminism views?
That's one of the factors that evoke their sentiments. Their resentment toward the women and feminism. But in China, it is very special that the family norm plays core value in shaping their manosphere ideas in China. Because their frustration are not just cannot find a partner or cannot find someone to marry, but the problem is the marriage itself. Because from my research, I have discovered a lot of discourse about their frustrations, about the cost of getting married and form a new family, and they think the financial cost of such thing is intolerable, and they find it's a burden that they cannot afford.
Is there truth in there? Like, how expensive is it?
The most frequent signify they use is the 彩礼, a bride price in English, and they in China's the marriage traditions, like especially in some provinces like Jiangxi or like Henan, and I think and the province like that, the 彩礼, the bride price may cost 200,000 RMB.
So that's a man having to pay that to the woman or the woman's family that he's about to marry.
It's not always the man himself. It's about the man's family. So it's interesting that when these men blame the women, they always evoke the discourse of filial piety, because they think they will evoke the discourse like their parents work hard throughout their life, but the marriage itself cost all their money. So they think the women not exploit the man himself, but also exploit the man's family as a whole. So they just use this kind of family discourse to moralize their blaming for women and to justify the victimhood of their own.
Actually, we need to also look at how one-child policy actually coincide with the economic reform in China, right? And then it is not to say that in the Mao era, such a phenomenon doesn't exist, saying that all there are like certain masculine expectation of men. But however, because of the economic reform, on the one hand, one-child policy creates this some preference that you mentioned. But on the other hand, research have been demonstrated that there's an unexpected sort of heavy investment on the daughters, especially urban daughters. So then these urban daughters sort of grow up with heavy investment on their education. But at the point, economic reform also means that in the Mao era, let's say in the 70s, China has one of the highest women's participation rate in labor. And then that's because of the work unit, people's commune, and the fact that the state feminism back then or socialism feminism back then really sort of alleviated some burdens of reproductive labor and also mobilized women to hold up half the sky, right? But however, now that women have a lot more education, but in the marketized space that make women redundant first in the market space. So it's like, oh, we have a lot of education, but once we go to work, oops, the old sort of patriarchal form is coming back, and now we're expected to be like this feminized, beautiful, like wife. And so that's just not it's gotta be like a shock for many young women growing up under the one child generation. And so we can see like since the early 2000s we had this discourse of leftover women, which means that it's your fault like not to get married.
Yeah, the I want to talk about Tylee because we have that in Singapore as well, but it's done more as a symbolic gesture. We give money, the family of the guy will give money to the bride's family at the gate. They call it gate crashing, right? Or rather we call it gate crashing. But in China, it's sort of like a social contract, right? And social contracts break all the time. It kind of seems like the easiest solution is to just ignore bride prices. So I guess what I'm saying is the demand for bride price coming from the women's side of the family, do they make it compulsory?
It's an interesting question. And for some conditions, you're right, especially in some big cities, cosmopolitan cities like Shanghai, Beijing, they just use the highly bride price for just a ritualized exchange, right? It's a rituals of the marriage itself. But especially in the rural areas, many research have shown that for some, the women's family and the women's family, their parents want to, exchange their daughters for money.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think to add on what Yuhan said is really the urban and rural divide. So for urban is more about class gatekeeping to make sure that the daughter is marrying to a person that's at least our class, or if not like better than our class. And it's also like very pragmatic, right? It's a pragmatic way of thinking. But in rural China, it's also pragmatism, but it's to buy off that reproductive labor that the woman would be contributing. And that's like more traditional in a way.
No, I wanted to pick up on what Ling said about, women holding up half the sky. Because growing up in Japan, we thought that China, at least in terms of women's labor participation, it's more equal. But where does the Chinese Communist Party stand on this rise of, I guess, anti-feminism move or trend or whatever you want to call it that we're especially seeing online?
Well, I mean, the official discourse is still that men and women are equal, right? That's in our constitution and since the 50s. And but however, it's just that in practice, how we see the different things sort of like shift throughout time. So China especially mainland China, do have a lot, so very advanced feminist practice. And it's also the same with concubinage, right? So for instance, in Hong Kong, it was only abolished in the 70s, well as the monogamous marriage based on sort of free will was already established in the 50s. And so there are a lot of wonderful things or progressive deeds that was being done with the socialist feminist paradigm. But the difference really, and also to connect to what we have discussed, is that this very top-down manner was almost a shock, when this happened to not all, but definitely some, like during the period when women need to hold up half the sky, right? So it also explained the repercussion. So women not only need to hold up half sky, but they're also expected to become Iron Lady. And this did not sort of register well with everybody.
We should probably say that was a saying of Mao Zedong.
Mao
We've
Zedong
been
says, yeah,
we've
women
been
hold up.
talking.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's pragmatic at the time because they need like women in the workforce, right? Just circle back to what you said, the point you brought up about social media, because I know that like around 2020, that was when the CCP intensified its crackdown on feminist content on social media. The reason they gave was that they want to crack down on extreme feminist ideas.
And they
And
detained some
they
very
deta-
prominent feminists.
exactly the famous Feminist Five.
Yeah.
Have they been cracking down on misogynist content the same way that they have with what they call extreme anti-feminist content? Because my theory is that they sort of caught in a rock and a hard place, because the narrative that the party has been using is that feminist movement is an import from the US and they're here to break social stability, and that's why they, I think, want to clamp down on that. But if they allow the misogynist content to grow to a critical mass, that's not going to be helpful for social stability as well.
Derek, you have mentioned the censorship of the popular feminism, censorship of the radical feminism, and but they also censor the so-called misogynistic content, especially when it direct their discontent to the social stability, discontent to the current state ideologies or the current arrangement of the family norms. So when some man says that I do not want to take the obligations of like earn a lot of money, work hard, become the cheap labor in many Chinese industries, they will be censored. And but if you express your discontent towards women, and women are bad, bad people, the feminism teach women to be bad, okay, you can survive. And also the platforms will amplify this kind of information that blame women, and women caused the mass burden.
Crackdown on feminism, as you said, in since the 2015, which is the crackdown, which is the detaining of the Feminist Five, actually goes hand in hand with the sort of like with the cracking down on civil society feminism or civil society NGO based like sort of activity as a whole. Because what also happened that year was the 709 detaining of human rights lawyers, and then 2 years after there's this like NGO overseas NGO law that basically makes it extremely difficult to run like a overseas funded NGO in China, and that started in relation to feminism is the 1995 United Nations Sports World Conference on Women in Beijing, right? And then people still talk about that conference today because it actually opens door to not just feminist NGOs, but NGOs in general. So when we talk about this cracking down, and also to say what do we mean by foreign forces here, it's actually this, that more like human right narrative based foreign funded NGO practice is considered to be dangerous. It's not just feminism, but also like human rights, like whatever in total. That's just to complicate this a little bit, but at the same time, men and women are equal, are in the constitution. So
my takeaway from this conversation with them is that the idea or the root behind a lot of the unhappiness of the men and manosphere in China is driven more by economic forces than it is ideological differences. And if that is the case, then it seems like a much easier, not easy, but like a easier problem to save when compared to the West, where it's ideological differences, and that divide is a lot harder to bridge. So in China, I don't know what recourse is there. I mean, a healthy debate space like Yihuan mentioned.
Or ditch the bride price.
Or ditch the bride. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that is not enshrined in law. That's just a social contract which can be broken.
Yeah.
Right?
What do you think, Ling?
Or let's put it this way. So if both of you are Chinese men wanting to get married, because romantic relationship and family is really important. And then now you're working really hard as like a white collar in like a big enterprise. And then you earn around, let's say, 15K RMB. But the real estate price is 7 million RMB. And then so in order to get married, your parents, both of them, maybe including your grandparents, are gonna help you with that. And then so now that you see online, there are like different debates. Would you rather blame or question why is the real estate price 7 million? Or would you say, why are women so greedy? Why do I need to buy the house? Why can't we buy it together? And even when we buy a house, why do I need to put their name first, or sometimes even just their names? The thing is, if no one is really talking about the sort of political economy of everything, then what we have at hand is this gendered sort of like debate or this gender antagonism that would land basically nowhere. And also it would also mean that there is, of course, more divide between sort of what men think and what women would think. And so it's sort of creating what we academic call intersectional feminism, which is the feminism that also care about class, also care about rural-urban divide, also care about all different type of oppressions, sort of impossible. And then that type of feminism can truly be for everybody, but it's not promoted.
It was a really insightful, really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Yi-Hwan and Ling.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so
Derek.
much.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've been watching Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service with me, Mariko Oi, in Singapore. If you have any questions or thoughts on what we covered in this episode or any other stories from the region, please leave us a comment below. You can also get in touch with us on email, asiapacific@bbc.co.uk, and click like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time!